Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 7 about the judicial branch. It's Lesson 3 about criminal law. In this lesson, you'll learn about the adversarial system, about the role of judges, about criminal law, about prosecutors and defendants, about criminal punishment, and about criminal proof. In previous lessons, we've been learning about the English judicial heritage that was inherited by the United States of America, that continues to influence how the courts in the United States of America operate. In the previous couple lessons, we learned about the common law and about trial by jury. In this lesson, you'll learn about the adversarial system. Now, to understand the adversarial system, we're going to construct a diagram. Let this first rectangle represent some person, whoever it may be. And that person is accusing somebody else of having done something bad to them. We're going to call that person in the adversarial system either a prosecutor or a plaintiff. Now, which name they have will depend on something that you're going to learn a little bit more about in this lesson and the lesson to follow. But for right now, just realize that this person who's making the accusation, who's claiming that somebody else did something wrong, is going to go by one of these two titles. Now, if we have somebody claiming that something was done wrong, there has to be the person that they're accusing of having done the wrong thing. Now, when I say person, again, we have to be careful. The person involved here could be some other entity, for example, a corporation or a government agency or something like that. But there's some other party that's being accused of having done a bad thing. We're going to call that person a defendant. Now, when we call them the defendant, that's implying that they're trying to defend themselves, which means they attack back against the prosecutor or the plaintiff. And in the adversarial system, you have these two parties essentially trying to prove each other wrong, trying to poke holes in each other's arguments. Now, while this is going on, you have to have somebody who's making sure that they're keeping the rules. For example, that they aren't just telling outright lies, or that they're not bringing in false witnesses, or whatever it may be. There's got to be some sort of rules to make sure that this game is being played fairly. There's got to be somebody who's making sure that those rules are being enforced. We're going to call that person a referee, because they're going to function like a referee in a sports match does. The referee is there just to make sure that the competing teams are following the rules of the sport, whatever it is. In our system of justice, that referee, the person who's in charge of making sure that the parties involved follow the rules, is the judge. So you have the prosecutor or plaintiff fighting it out with the defendant, attacking each other, trying to prove each other wrong, and the judge is sitting there neutrally, not taking sides, trying to make sure that both sides follow the rules. But who's going to decide in this system who actually wins? Well, as you learned about in the previous unit, that's the job of the jury, a collection of our fellow citizens. They're going to sit there and watch this battle, this competition, and hopefully from this clash, as they tear each other's arguments apart, the jury will be able to figure out what the truth actually is. Now, this adversarial system that we use to determine who's right and wrong, who's guilty or innocent in the American courts, while for somebody growing up in America it may seem like, obviously, oh, that's how the courts work. That's not how they work many other places in the world. Many other places operate on what can be called an inquisitorial system. It's based upon, the root here is the same as inquire. So in that system, yes, you've got somebody who's accusing somebody else of having done something bad. But rather than those two parties fighting it out with each other, instead you have a group of judges who are acting as investigators, detectives, trying to figure out what's really going on. They'll ask both parties questions. They'll ask both parties to produce evidence. And the judges are not only investigating, and also performing the function of making sure people follow rules. But they're also the ones that are deciding who's guilty or innocent. That's why I have that green box around them also. Remember, when I was diagramming the adversarial system, the green box was for the jury, the ones that would decide guilt or innocent. Well, the judges in an inquisitorial system decide that too. So the judges are detectives investigating, and in the end they decide who's telling the truth from their point of view and decide who's guilty or innocent. This is how much of the rest of the world operates their court systems. So this adversarial system that we have in the United States of America is again another example of what we inherited from the judicial system of England that had developed over hundreds of years. The adversarial system can actually be divided up into two separate systems. One covers criminal law, the other civil law. In this lesson, we're going to look at the part that covers criminal law. And we're going to examine 4 specific aspects of criminal law. We're going to look at what offenses fall under criminal law, who the parties are in these criminal law cases, what punishments are available to the people who are found guilty, and what sort of proof is required to decide whether or not they're guilty. So let's begin by talking about the offenses that are covered by criminal law. Criminal law deals with crimes. Now, that may seem obvious to you. Well, it says criminal law. Of course it's dealing with crimes. But what does that really mean? A crime is somebody acting in a way that's prohibited by law. Now, notice what this means. It means that if there's some law that's been passed by a legislature that says you shouldn't do something, and then you go do it anyway, you're acting as a criminal. It doesn't matter whether or not you think that it was actually the morally right thing to do. It doesn't matter whether it actually hurts somebody or not. For example, one of the debates in the United States of America is about whether or not marijuana should be legal. People who support the legalization of marijuana will say, well, if you're going to make it a crime, it's a victimless crime. It doesn't actually hurt anybody to use marijuana, and therefore it should be legal to do. Well, this notion of crime is not based on whether or not what you do actually hurts someone. It's based on the fact that it has been outlawed, whether it hurts someone or not. If the legislature passes a law and says you're not allowed to do something, and then you go do it anyway, that is a crime. And that is the kind of thing that is covered by criminal law. Now, who are the parties in a criminal law case? Remember this diagram that we had just a few moments ago about the adversarial system. On one side, we got the prosecutor or plaintiff accusing somebody of having done something bad. On the other side, we have the defendant who is accused of doing the bad thing. So whichever we're talking about, whether we're talking about criminal or civil law, on one side we're going to have the defendant, the person who's been accused of having done something bad. In a criminal law situation, what they're accused of is having committed a crime, having broken a law. Well, who's on the other side? The person who's arguing that a crime was committed is the prosecutor. So in a criminal law case, the person on the side that's doing the accusing, that is the label they're given. That's the person who's standing in the court saying, this person committed a crime, called a prosecutor. The prosecutor represents the government. They are a lawyer acting on behalf of the government, trying to argue that a crime was actually committed. Now, the reason they're representing the government is because what this case is about, if it's a criminal case, is about whether or not a law has been broken. It's about whether or not the government has in some way been disobeyed. So it's the government that's going to be in there making the accusation that this person committed a crime. Now, they may do that based on someone coming in and saying somebody did something to me. So a person comes in and says, I got beat up in an alley. Then the government says, oh, that person assaulted you. That's a crime. We, the government, are going to take them to court, accuse them of this crime. If we get a conviction from the jury, we're the ones that then will be punishing them. The next aspect of criminal law to talk about is what punishments are available. Okay, so the offense is that you've broken a law. The parties involved are the prosecutor who's making the accusation that a law was broken, trying to convince the jury of that, and the defendant who say, no, 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 I didn't break the law. Now, if the defendant loses, if the jury says that they're guilty, what punishments might the government inflict upon them? In other words, what can the government do to us if we are found guilty of committing a crime? Well, one thing they could do to us is take away our property through some sort of fine. Like the example in the background picture here is someone receiving a speeding ticket where then they have to go pay money for. Another thing the government can do to you is take away your liberty. In other words, imprison you. Now, that's a very potentially harsh thing to have happen depending on where you're imprisoned and how long. And finally, the government can do the worst possible thing. They can take away your life through execution. What's being shown in the background here is someone who's about to receive a lethal injection. They're going to have their life ended by the government because the government has decided that whatever they did was bad enough, a serious enough violation of a law, that their life should be ended. Okay, so the criminal law covers offenses that are crimes where we've broken a law. The parties involved are a prosecutor and a defendant. The punishments include you losing your property, you losing your liberty, and even losing your life. Now, that's pretty serious stuff. So what level of proof is required? In other words, how sure do they have to be whether or not you're guilty? Let's be even more specific. Generally in a case, we're talking about how sure does the jury have to be that you committed a crime? These average American citizens who are brought in to decide your guilt or innocence, how sure do they have to be that you actually did the thing? In a criminal case, in order to convict you, a jury has to believe that you're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, what is meant by that is that if they have doubts, and those doubts are logical, that's what reasonable means, they should let you go. Now think about that. First of all, the doubts have to be reasonable. The doubts can't be, oh, he's too cute to do something like that. Okay, that's not a reasonable doubt. But on the other hand, if it's, well, oh my gosh, I don't think those were his fingerprints on the gun, then that's something that could raise reasonable doubt. And if a juror has any doubt like that, they're supposed to let you go. Now, they still may think that you're probably guilty, but if they have doubts, they're supposed to let you go. Let's use a real-world example to illustrate this. The person depicted here is a man named O.J. Simpson, a very famous American from a few years ago. He was a remarkable college and professional football player who's in the National Football League Hall of Fame. He then went on to be a famous actor, famous TV personality. He was eventually accused of murder, of having murdered his ex-wife and a waiter from a restaurant who happened to be dropping off a pair of sunglasses at her house at the time that she had left at the restaurant that night. Somebody slit their throats and murdered them, and O.J. Simpson was accused of the crime. Well, how sure would the jury need to be of whether or not he was guilty of that crime of murder on a scale from 0 to 100? Well, among the evidence that they were shown of why he was thought to be the murderer was a bloody glove that was found on his property. The blood on the glove was from the murder victims. And this was not the only bit of evidence that they found that potentially would lead them to think he was guilty. There was blood on his vehicle from the victims. There was blood on his socks from the victims. There were cuts on his hands that could have came from wielding a knife as he killed somebody else. There was a lot of things to think that he was potentially guilty. But at the same time, when his trial was held, and they got out this bloody glove, and they asked him to try it on, it didn't fit. He couldn't get it on his hand. Now, when the jury saw that he couldn't get it on his hand, later on, his defense attorney said to them, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Acquit is a way of saying, let him go. Don't find him guilty. Now, remember the standard that the jury is supposed to apply is guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So if they have any doubts that are rational doubts or reasonable, logical doubts, they're supposed to let him go. Well, seeing him unable to put the glove on would that be sufficient for them to then decide that they have doubts whether he's actually the murderer? Even though they have all this other evidence that might think he is the murderer, seeing that he couldn't fit the glove on, is that enough for them to then doubt whether he actually did it? Perhaps. Because that's a very high standard if we put it on this scale. Beyond a reasonable doubt, does that mean that you're 95% sure, 98% sure, 99% sure that he actually committed the murder? It's somewhere up that high. Basically, if you have any doubt, you're supposed to let him go. And that's what they did in this case. They found O.J. Simpson not guilty. So now let's review what you learned in this lesson. How is truth found in an adversarial system? Is it the two sides arguing with each other? Is it the two sides cooperating with each other? Is it that the court investigates to find out what happened? Or is one side forced to confess? In an adversarial system, the two sides argue with each other. And hopefully, from that argument, the truth is exposed. In an adversarial system, what is the judge's job? Is the judge an investigator, a prosecutor, a defender, or a referee? The judge is a referee, and what we mean by that is it's the judge's job to make sure that the parties to the case keep the rules. The judge isn't there to try to find out what really happened, or to investigate, or to determine guilt or innocence. They're there just to make sure everyone follows the rules. Now, in a criminal case, what supposedly happened? Was it a law was supposedly broken, or was it supposedly somebody was harmed, or supposedly some property was damaged, or supposedly some money was lost? In a criminal case, the concern is that a law was broken. In a criminal case, who argues that the crime took place? Is it the defendant, the judge, the plaintiff, or the prosecutor? In a criminal case, it's the prosecutor that's arguing that a crime happened. What is the most extreme punishment that someone can receive in a criminal case? Is it that they'll have to pay money, or they'll have to go to prison, or they'll be executed, or that they'll have to plead guilty? In a criminal case, the most extreme thing that can happen is they can actually be executed. Their life can be ended. And then what level of proof is needed in a criminal case? Is it probable cause, preponderance of the evidence, reasonable suspicion, or beyond a reasonable doubt? It is beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, take the principle from the last question that the worst punishment that can be inflicted is death. And then you can see why such a high standard is used in a criminal case. That the jury has to be certain that the person is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Because the punishments that can be inflicted are so severe, our system biases itself to be more in favor of letting a few guilty people go free to make sure that no innocent person goes to prison, rather than the other way around. Because we're so worried about how bad the punishments can be. Not just fines, but losing their liberty in prison, or even losing their lives. We've got to make it tough to convict them. That completes this lesson. The next lesson will be also from Unit 7. It'll be Lesson 4 about the civil law.